Good evening, Rebekah.
Good evening.
So it's been a while that we've been talking about doing this stream, and we've been. I remember a couple of weeks ago talking with your students, and then we had this deeper conversations about hackathons, and you've been in another hackathon recently. One thing before we get into the topic of today, which is already down there on the yellow. I was really curious, Rebekah. I was looking you up online and some of your papers and publications. One thing that popped up in your LinkedIn profile was the idea of a research artist whose performative context is science.
Yes.
Now, that was really intriguing. What's all that about?
Well, I'd say that kind of links into my approach to non-institutional art. I've actually trained as a visual artist. And ironically, back in my early days, well, I was trained as a printmaker. I minored as a drawer.
Wow.
And then I graduated and I started performance because I noticed it was cheaper and I actually got paid. And ironically, back in those earlier days, I had this, what do we call it? You know, not a pseudonym, a kind of alter ego, the researcher. And the researcher did lots of research. She wrote books. And she also did long performances. I mean, she gave lectures for 36 hours. And so I actually kind of, I guess, bridged my art career into academia. And as I've been going along, I mean, it's been quite a journey as well. I wasn't quite so aware that I was still being an artist within academia, but I realized one day, I mean, that, hang on a second, you know, like I am still doing my art. The way they approach research is through an artist's eyes. I mean, oftentimes I found myself in projects where I had very little information and had to put bits and pieces together and then pretend that I knew what I was doing. But then, of course, I turned that into a craft and an art. But ironically, actually, having trained as an artist and be a fully qualified artist, when I first started as a researcher in user psychology, something I knew nothing about. I'd go into work meetings and particularly industrial meetings, and I tried to kind of cover that information up. I thought it would be something to be embarrassed about. You know, I didn't want to come out of the closet about being an artist. And then one day when I've been mingling with some spectacular people in industry and I started finding out that art is trendy, then I started opening up about my artist history. And that's when I embraced this idea of, well, actually, you know, you might take the artist out of the art, but you can't take the art out of the artist. So just embrace it, go with it. And that's what I do. I mean, very much. I'm a researcher, but then at the same time, the way I approach research is through art.
That makes it very unusual and very probably enriching as well for the students who follow you, who have you, to have that sort of different dimension about it. Before we go any further, Rebekah, I just wanted to acknowledge those in the chat and introduce you to the people coming to join us. You might also be asking questions, and that's a hint to you all in the chat. If you want to ask questions, I am looking at the chat. I might not be able to answer straight away, but I will be putting in the questions to Rebekah. I've also had questions from other people before about you joining tonight. Little few words about Rebekah. Why is Rebekah even here tonight in the stream? For multiple set of reasons. First of all, not just the sort of performing art dimension of your science and art together, which is a beautiful mix. There's also you're interested in values, logic, thoughts, emotions, and hugely importantly, ethics, user-centered design, AI, the transition of technology, and all those big questions that humanity is facing are right at the center of what your focus is on. So, you know, to name but a few tags that I had in my mind when I looked you up, it was like elevator UX.
Once you go elevator, you never go back.
Elevate. And by the way, I started to laugh because pretty much all the articles that you were publishing, I had some kind of connection to in some past, very different, not in science, but in other forms of research. Like I did work with elevators on Connie, and you talked about children's concept of mental well-being. Been working a lot with education.
My colleagues mostly, yeah.
So obviously you're bringing together a lot of work from other PhDs, and that's part of your job. Now, one thing, so in today's topic, before we go into the actual conversation itself, most people just jump straight in. Small talk leads to one another, and then it just goes on into. I'm going to frame today's conversation for those watching, and also because we're looking at ourselves, you and I, talking from a meta perspective, from a metacognitive perspective. So it's also to help us analyze later how we're talking and see what happens, what makes the wow factor, not just in the design, but in the conversation, if you like. Here, in terms of the process, I'm just going to draw quickly what we're doing. In terms of safety, like usually people don't talk about psychological safety because it's not a fashionable topic in day to day.
Are you kidding?
But here, I heard some beautifully cute voices behind you. So if any time you need to just pop out and deal with children emergencies, go for it. Please respect yourself, okay?
Yes, it's not unfamiliar to me to jump out of a meeting to, well, attend to people's needs.
I just wanted to mention that so you don't feel you have to be like glued to the screen if there's an emergency in the background. Another thing is, in terms of the process, this is what I'm intending for today. So I'm going to draw this on the doodle board here. I'm actually going to hide, otherwise it's just weird to have me in the front. So usually in a process, I like to think of a timeline like this, where we start with a divergent conversation where we're going to open up. I'm going to open up questions with you that people have been asking me about these topics and see where it opens up. Then we go to this sort of messy zone, which is often called the groan zone, which is where beautiful chaos, conversation leads to some interesting unknowns. There's possibly ideas, thoughts, and things like that. And then we gradually converge, a bit like in a hackathon where you start to collect the ideas and build them. Here we would be sort of converging, no longer with open questions, but starting to think, so what? So that's the kind of idea that I was thinking for today. And the idea of quantum conversation is something that we can talk about later as well. But it's the idea of this conversation is not to be just an interview or one-on-one conversation. It's more like being in a lounge together, having a cup of tea, and exploring creatively our thinking more as a dialogue. Okay, so that's really just for the framing and just to get going in the opening up of questions. I had a question from somebody who was asking me about age and diversity of interests in terms of communication. So you get a lot of older people who, in their couple, and this was the question, how do I get more elder people to re-engage with the topic of communication when they've cynically lost interest in talking to each other? Very hard question, isn't it?
Food. I mean, and good ones.
Food.
I mean, good food. Yeah. I mean, I would imagine because, of course, as we're growing older, our interests change. Very much on the basis of our biology. I mean, of course, our psychobiology or psychophysiology as well. There might be kind of immaterial reasons for us to, change our interests, based on experiences and that type of thing. It is quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, because quite a few years ago, colleagues and I were actually researching solitude, the difference between solitude and loneliness, and solitude being the fact that, many people actually enjoy being alone. I mean, they enjoy spending time with themselves, and for various reasons, they're not actually experiencing any sensation of loneliness. And I mean, I guess that's something that, unless we're there and unless we're experiencing it for ourselves, it's very hard for us to actually know. And to know the sensations of solitude and maybe kind of, I guess, not that kind of like driven enthusiasm to engage with others. And of course, this links to developmental psychology as well, and the various stages of life, and when we want to identify with people, when we want to find our life mates, and then when we feel fulfilled, when we're getting towards this kind of like end sprint of our lives. So, but yeah, to engage, I guess it's also defining what engagement is, defining what communication is, and particularly meaningful communication, because there also might be many people who are experiencing loneliness for one reason or another and are extremely grateful for any kind of communication, or meaningful engagement that they have with other people. And then that could also be largely dependent on context, and of course food.
Food is an interesting one, because like if you think back to the start of Restaurant Day, Ravintola-päivä, that started actually in Helsinki, it was really the whole movement, like street protest, was initially about positive protest around food regulations in restaurants, but then it turned into really just a place where people are having great conversations in the street with strangers. So absolutely, the food, like I think that's a really great simple way of reestablishing, at least if there is a desire, like you said, for that meaningful level, or less meaningful, just small talk, at least then the food opens that vector. So that's an interesting direction, food. Then it opens up all the non-verbals and other senses, because when you're talking about food, you're including other things than just ears and eyes. You're starting to have hands.
And taste, flavor, the combination of your mouth and your nose, and of course through your nose when you're receiving smells, it's actually going directly to the place right near your limbic system. So actually the smells are not being processed or interpreted on their way towards your emotions. And that's the reason why we find ourselves often turning around if we smell someone walking past on the street and they're wearing the same perfume that your mother did when you were 5 years old. I mean, that'll take you back automatically. So yeah, absolutely. And from that perspective, of course, mood and food couldn't really be very, very meaningful and engaging for an older person as well. But of course, taking into account the fact that our senses also deteriorate over time. So that's something to also consider.
So one of the other thoughts or topic areas before we go into the meat of the whole ethics, which is a big topic, the difference between face-to-face and virtual, so webcams, Zooms. I'm not necessarily even going into the whole AR or augmented, any kind of augmentedness, but just basic video conferencing. And a lot of people have been asking me, like, how do you because it's not the same, and everybody will agree. There's like a great way of being empathic in the beginning of a meeting is voice the elephant in the room, that everybody's suffering with the technological conversations versus the face. It's like motor way of thinking. But what is measured or measurable in terms of that difference? Because it's clear that we have a screen and it's not the richness of face-to-face, but what do you know about how is there some kind of way that we can measure and quantify that difference in quality of communication?
Well, yeah, there would be. For instance, I mean, biometric experiments would be very interesting to engage in. For instance, of course, self-reporting techniques where people are actually telling about their experiences, but, to actually see how the bodies are reacting within the same space of the bodies. Because in a sense, we also have so many unconscious experiences, like the sensations that are received to us that we're not really actively representing. So, things like movement and heat and maybe smells even, like that are going in undetected. And, like all of these things kind of contribute to this face-to-face communication. And I mean, I'm not sure about you, but have you ever found that, once you've actually met people in real life, you've had these kind of like real life connections, then suddenly the online Zooms become easier? I mean, somehow they become more embodied because of course, then you have more sense data that you can refer to. You actually can remember the sensations of being in the same room as these people. So it's pretty logical, actually. One of my old colleagues / contacts from around the world, Adrian David Chiok, and his teams, they've been developing multisensory internet. I mean, naturally, it's not quite available these days yet, except for in some devices, Senti, Kissinger, and these T jackets for children with autism. But still, you can actually see that there would be a place for those, especially if we're bound to these kind of Zoom-like experiences for we are fully embodied individuals that are surviving on more than just haptics and sight and sound.
Yeah, because I mean, when I started building the periodic table, I was looking at all the non-verbals, and the first thing that I was looking at is that there is no longer just 5 senses, but there's been established quite actually a dozen, and those are very active. Like if you think of the kinesthetic sense, the sense of acceleration, those movement-oriented position in space, all that. Obviously, on a Zoom, it's very, very two-dimensional, but that with the metaverse might start to shift. And you've been testing stuff with different levels of sensorial engagement, haven't you, in the VME context?
I've been theorizing about it, and more through our VME interaction design environment. Been testing different solutions, and even yesterday I had the pleasure of being involved in the XR Ocean hackathon that I did at that desktop style. And I think at the moment, because I am such an embodied person, I get quite frustrated with those systems. I don't like my body a different place to my eyes, and so I mean I'm more inclined to break the computers through my want to walk and my need to walk. So it is a problem, but I'm fascinated, and the things that I'm really fascinated about, I mean, in terms of VR, is environmental VR. I mean, I like the thought of something that's not over my eyes, or any of my loved ones' eyes.
So more like, how does that work then?
Like being in a space, walking into a room and being transported to another planet. I mean, that would be cool.
So almost like fully immersive in a way, like
absolutely,
what the video game industry is aiming.
Yeah, exactly. Rather than just something over your eyes.
Right. Okay, here's something that might get you going on a long tangent. I don't know, but what rants have you got about the field that you're working in? I mean, there must be something that you get deeply irate about.
On which level? From which?
Okay, let's sandbox this to myths, maybe, that people are still having, because every field has its own knowledge that is better than the general knowledge. So they're myths. There's misunderstandings, myths about people not getting along, things that the fundamental fallacies that people have around the topic of cognitive science and community. There's too many of them. Maybe it's still too wide.
There's so many. Of course, there's this, objective versus subjective, never-ending discussion. And of course, people, saying that, yes, we're interested in quality, and particularly we're interested in the experience, but, let's do that through numbers and quantities. And then at the end of the day, of course, you're at the mercy of the qualitative material, the framing that those numbers are produced through. So that's one rant.
So qualitative versus quantitative. The other thing that we started a conversation on a few weeks ago was this idea that designers and developers sometimes don't even know their users.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, actually, I don't know. I mean, see, I be fair to designers. I think that designers are doing a super cool job these days, because I feel that they're wearing many, many different hats, as scientists and ethnographers. And I mean, you're a living example. So, but I'd say that maybe, like in surprising tech areas that I would assume as a human computer interaction researcher would be naturally human-centered, I would imagine, based around human interactions. Those ones I've been quite surprised. For instance, with the development of VR, many times over the last few weeks, I've just been interested in knowing, what can we do to help you from the user perspective, user research perspective. We've got these tools, we could look at this, and then there's silence. Or how have you involved?
So is it because they don't understand, or is it just
they
that
don't
they don't
understand? One person has said that, this sounds like Chinese to me. It's like, Well, maybe it's my Australian accent. I mean, I've got to change that. But then also, I've asked, how have you considered users within your process? How have you involved users? Have you done any testing? Have you got plans for testing? And then I've had many people, turn around and say, could you please rephrase that, huh? Again,
really,
it's probably my
lack of. In a way, I mean, I've noticed that as a designer, literally everywhere I go, when I start working with innovation, the very first conversation has to be, are we putting the users at the beginning of the process, or do we do that at the end when we've already designed everything? And so like my rant in that is quite close, because I had to always draw the diagram of the part that makes money, the part that's technically possible, and the part that humans want, and you need the overlap in the middle, and start from people is often just a huge revelation for people working in innovation, particularly in tech-driven companies. Like a lot of them are in Finland, where they're very heavily on R&D, and technology is the thing, money and technology.
I'm sorry. I will in a second. You've got to get in there first. We do have to have a bio break in a moment, but it's not mine. It's someone else's.
Go for it.
Okay, so you can continue without me for a few minutes.
respect the family needs. I will continue with the chat. So, question while you're heading off is, are there any other questions that, from other than the ones that I just voiced from earlier, that you'd like to ask Rebekah? We can have some open questions about. I think ethics is a topic that would be interesting to explore. I also noted down earlier somebody asking me about the whole children and how communication is going to shift for next generations. That was another topic. And neurodiversity was something else that popped up from other people who were giving me questions. So what about you in the chat? What would you like to hear and find out more about from Rebekah? I'm going to now put a little technical video break while we're waiting for her to join. And you'll notice that this is a video that's got the icon from the periodic table head-up display, which is really a kind of prototype that's very close to what Rebekah's doing on researching interface between people. We're using that metaphor of a head-up display to portray how do you analyze human communication without getting too lost in it. So we have this head-up display, which is like a filter, like a mask, like a lens that you put over any situation of communication that you can analyze and measure with 8 different lenses. So that's what this is all about. And we're back with Rebekah. So I'm going to now hide this video that is very beautiful, and it's actually quite close to where you are in Vasa. This is Lapland. But let's go back to our conversation. So one thing, Rebekah, is ethics. So ethics, it's really hard to have ethics in design if people are not even considering the people, let alone the ethics, which is probably the most nebulous and deep topic around human-centered design. So how on earth do you get people to consider ethics?
Well, actually, I've got a great colleague, Ville Vakkuri, who's developed a tool. So you don't really have to think about the people. You just can use this tool. No, just kidding. But the tool's really great. Ekkola, I mean, for including in the development process of AI software. But yeah, no, it's of course, we're still in early days, even if we've talked about the same things, for decades, if not centuries. And surprisingly, even during the 1980s, there were really advanced discussions in regards to the types of issues we're facing regarding, for instance, computer ethics, bias, for instance, and many other ones, privacy, of course. So it's actually quite fascinating that still now it's like we're at the beginning phases. We were just talking about this with colleagues today, namely Ville as well. because it seems like we have a sense of amnesia, both in respect to remembering users within particularly software development, and of course anything to do with computers, even if it is for people. And then in turn also, these ethical considerations. And of course the things with ethics is they're very, very tightly related to culture or linked to culture. So what is right
Mm,
in one culture is not necessarily right in another. But then it's very interesting and important to understand that, ethics are also tightly connected to emotions and the way that we perceive and, understand phenomena that we're coming into contact with. And so, of
mm.
course, how we respond to those through our emotions. So, yeah.
So the filters, in a way, the bias that we're having is first cultural, then
Mhm.
it's going to be, so we're then going to have our own emotional filters and bias. And then on top of that, then we have our own cognitive bias around that whole thing because we're not accurate about what we're really doing versus what we think we're doing.
Yeah,
So,
and of course, it's not really that neat. I mean, we can't tell which comes first, the chicken or the egg. I mean, these
mm,
processes are happening all at the same time.
yeah.
But it is extremely important to remember the aspect of culture in relation to understanding, both cognition and emotions, as well as, of course, ethics, and then how these are all linked.
So ethics, in a way, what can you give us an example of one ethical knot that's like a big ethical topic or question that is being grappled at the moment?
There's many of these. I mean, we've got the classics. Will the robots take over our jobs? Of course, the bias in the algorithms, the
Hmm.
preferences of particular cultures, and of course, categorization of specific features. Like
Mm.
within images, for instance. Um, there's also, of course, the problems of the black box. Can we call it a syndrome? I mean, and of course, black box is interesting from the cognitive science perspective because that relates to, how we understand or don't understand, like human thinking and the human mind. But of
Mm.
course, the fact that we're striving to create self-learning systems, self-learning machines, or as I've actually been writing about lately, learning machinery, but then we're still wanting to understand what they're doing it all the time. I mean, it's basically, wanting to have our cake and eat it too.
Mm.
So, I mean, even the very, I guess, attempts to create, like learning machinery is kind of like, I guess, like a juxtaposition of ethical thinking if we're wanting to, for instance, bypass this black box of not knowing what the algorithms are doing when they're thinking for themselves.
So black box, by that I mean, like a good example might be then how does the YouTube search algorithm work,
Yeah,
or something
absolutely.
like that. So that even if you're an expert user of YouTube or Google search, you
Hmm.
don't necessarily know what are the exact criteria that means that something's going to rank or not.
Absolutely.
Black box, yeah. So okay, present future. So now things are moving fast towards the metaverse. There's a lot of hype around what's going to happen there. There's two different things. There's what you see is going, and then there's what you think should be going. So maybe let's start with where you see things going right now. If we look at, like, let's do a bit of like gross trend thinking. But
Mm.
if what's how's it going to look like for your kids to be interacting with other people through technology?
I mean, well, see, this is also difficult. I mean, I'm guessing that, of course, our dreams are becoming realities, and we'll be, well, maybe not quite teleporting, but holograms could be a very real thing. I mean, already we can rig up fairly cheap holograms on our desks, for instance, with a few
Mm,
TVs and some perspex, and so there you go. And of course maybe this multisensory internet. I kind of see us a little bit of a fork road at the moment. We've got a lot of utopian speech at the moment. We've got some really super cool trends, and I know I'm not supposed to talk about trends, but of course, discursively, we're talking about sustainability and equality, like social responsibility. Understanding that, unless we take action now, there's not going to be an earth for us in, not such a long period of time. We can already see big evidence of global warming. So we have that in public awareness, and we have some super cool business activities happening around this. Many amazing efforts. I can see Anton there in the chat.
Yes.
And so stuff that you do, stuff that Anton does.
Yeah, well, exactly. Anton is, by the way, listening to us, who's actually planet-centric designer expert. So digging on that, like, of course, everybody thinks sustainability and they go to the sort of motorway of thinking, which is CO2 and all that. But there's a lot more to it than that. There's social responsibility, as you said. There's also the systemic design that Anton knows full well and is working on a lot. Like, how do you look at the whole big picture? What about in communication? Like, because I was talking about this also this week about what is sustainability in communication. Because we often dissociate people from nature as if it was like we're outside of it, but we're just animals. And if we disregard our planet, are we also disregarding humans' nature?
Well, yeah. See, I mean, of course, and there's various takes on the animalisticness of human beings, but I mean, certainly something that is undeniable is the fact that we rely on the earth. We are a part of the earth. This is here. If the earth dies, we do die. So that's a fact. And in terms of communication, well, as I was kind of talking about before, like a big part of the sustainability movements is based on language. And the language we're using, the way that we're framing the problems and understanding them and approaching. And then, of course, our interaction with other people, like to be able to get, like social emotional involvement and, get people, to actually commits to change. So, that's really important. But of course, at the same time, there's a lot of things that are happening kind of below the bonnet as well. And that's why I see at the moment where we are is at a forkroad. I mean, we're also looking at a time of kind of, I guess, surveillance economy, interesting kind of crises, or not so interesting, absolutely devastating crises. We can see a lot of power being in the hands of very few people. And so we're kind of trying to address this, but then at the same time, and we're also trying to grab group thought and group emotions to be able to, harness, a positive direction for our futures. But then at the same time, there's a lot of these things that are happening despite our wonderful talk and solidarity. And so, and from that perspective, then, there's a lot of questions about the future.
The whole narrative, the very dystopian narrative that is relayed and invested in by a lot of social media relays is something that I noticed in Kurzgesagt, the science channel, the German science channel. They had a really interesting video about 7 months ago, which was called Good News. It was about the climate. And the video was actually addressing what you said, which is that the way we frame the problem is literally the key, because a lot of the time, if we frame it as being an impossible thing to solve, obviously people are just going to go into a farm, go self-sufficient, hide from society, go off the grid, and that doesn't solve anything. That just gets a couple of people off the grid. So the whole dystopian narrative based on fear is, according to the Kurzgesagt video that I saw, one of the major problems to solve, beyond the whole engineering aspect of how we're going to clean up the CO2 and do supply chains responsibly. There is actually a fundamental question of how we're even thinking about this and how we're talking about it.
Well, fear is paralyzing, and fear is how the enemy wins. So have no fear. Absolutely not.
And the younger generations that are coming to solve some of the problems alongside us older people, they're going to be quite often encouraged to just give up. I mean, I'm seeing this around. There's people saying, "Oh, what's the point? I can't do anything about it. Politicians are all corrupt. The world's already, and that really doesn't bring anything." So, as you said, fear is the enemy. How do we how do we bring the good news? How do we bring the positivity and the sort of hopefulness with science is kind of what I'm interested in, what you're so interested in. So I'm wondering now, should we start getting towards that creative thinking of how might we, how might we, if we take one of Anton's favorite questions, how might we bring more awareness of the power that we have to solve things in technology and communication? Because I mean, technology is an incredible tool.
This is
Let's
a
go.
it's a big question. I've got someone who's come with his toothbrush.
And he's also going to be asking that question in a couple of years.
I think so. A very easy question to answer. Absolutely. And there's many discussions specifically on this. Particularly, okay. So basically, of course, bringing in the optimism of science, good news of science. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead if you need to go and do some teeth. I can continue a little bit here on.
Yeah, actually. Well, I mean,
the voice is now muted anyway. So Anton, if you're still listening, I'm curious about what question you'd like to ask Rebekah on the topic of sustainability, since it's your field. I'm going to share a little thought we were having with the team here about communication and sustainability. The positivity is one thing, but most often what we've been noticed in our measures is actually that people are deeply disregarding their own human nature, a bit like they're doing with the environment. So the same patterns of behavior that people have with disrespecting the planet, trashing, is actually happening in people's minds to themselves. And I'm noticing an interesting pattern of the way that it seems to be that, and I haven't measured this particular correlation of internal versus external, but it seems that people often are extremely unkind to themselves or disrespecting their own human nature, which has its quirkiness and its limitations, just like the planet does with the field's crop yield is limited, right? So how might we cultivate the collective human potential is kind of what we got with that. And going from the premise that humans are fundamentally just a part of nature, and that if we are starting to look at ourselves more respectfully internally, there's the chance that we're going to start to be more respectful to other human beings as well, outside of our own heads. So as now, Rebekah, you've joined in, I was just doing a segue here about sustainability and looking at our own human nature. And I was sharing a point of view that with Green Elephant, we've been formulating gradually around that people, there might be a correlation, and I don't know, this is maybe something you've seen being measured, but it seems that if somebody is disrespecting the planet, in other words, they're just ignorant of the effect that they have on the supply of food, whatever, and the choices they make in the shop, the disrespect towards the planet, I'm interested to see if there's a correlation with the disrespect to one's own human nature, our own self. So if I'm unkind to myself, shouting in my head, being unkind, how likely is it that I'm going to be also disrespecting the planet? And Anton also had a question that he's just posted. People love storytelling, and the fundamentals of society are built on stories that we align around and believe bang on. Anton, that is absolutely true. And therefore, what are the stories that we should be rewriting? Just like history is a collective narrative that we write and rewrite, what is the collective narrative that we should rewrite? And this is starting to give me inspiration and ideas about what we could do with this conversation to go further than just reflecting. Today, Anton says we're following the wrong narrative. I definitely agree with that. I don't know about you, Rebekah, but there's a narrative out there that's not too helpful.
Absolutely. I agree. Definitely. I mean, we're going perfectly down the road of Terminator. I mean, so absolutely. I'd say that we are self-fulfilling our prophecies, and we definitely need more alternative narratives.
Here's a very concrete example, because alternative narratives, they exist. They're just not necessarily followed. So what I've done 3 years ago when I started looking into this really deeply is that I unfollowed certain narratives in social media, and I started literally searching and hunting for different narratives. And I found a lot of positive narratives. A lot of people, the ones I've been following most, are usually either business people or designers who've become ecologists. But I
Yeah.
don't mean in the sense grassroots living on a farm, but I'm talking about people who've studied the complexity of ecosystems in a very, very deep way, and understanding that complexity, inspiring like biomimicry in design, inspiring ourselves from nature for how things can be
Okay.
done. Go for
Hey,
it.
before we
Something's
started
popping up.
this, you told me that you could look up anything. If I said a movie, then you could look up anything.
Go on.
Okay, and I can say that I've been going through a change process, for many years now. I guess 2016 when John McClure from 500 Startups told us at Slash to wake the fuck up when Trump got voted in. From that moment onwards, I started kind of having this rebirth process. From February 2017, I saw this incredible movie, Down to Earth.
Down to Earth. I'm going to look for the trailer in YouTube so then we can get some.
Exactly. So Wolf, from what Winter, I think was the director's last name. Rolf Winter, was it? But Down to Earth. It was about a Dutch family that sold up in Holland or the Netherlands.
This one
Stopped
here?
their jobs.
Let's see. If I show you this, I'm going to put the trailer in the background. Of course, I've got now the ads.
Oh, yeah.
Down to Earth. This one here. If I hide behind my screen, there we go. Downtoearthfilm.com. I think that's it.
I know it by the image. There's an Indigenous and Australian woman, the back of her against a blue sky, often when you see.
This is the actual whole thing. This is not the trailer. Sorry. Okay, I'll keep searching as you talk. So in a way, that movie was a transformational one.
Well, that was definitely, absolutely. So we had the actual director there telling us about his journey, about their decision to just kind of, they saw that their kids were getting, absorbed into their mobile technologies and and they weren't feeling so overly happy with their lives. They became troubled and they wanted to kind of, I guess, disrupt the road that they were on. So they quit their jobs, they sold up, and they decided to travel around the world and visit Indigenous communities everywhere. They wanted to seek wisdom keepers to tell them, what is life all about. And it's a very moving movie. That was the start. That was definitely, I think that this definitely looks like the right one. Absolutely. That was at the beginning of my journey, and I would say that this would be a place to start if you're starting to feel a little bit disgruntled with the way things are now.
I found the trailer. I've thrown it into the chat as well. I'm definitely going to look this up. Also, a really good point by Anton is Yuval's work, Yuval Noah Harari.
Oh, absolutely.
I've read all his book as well. There's I think his book that's the second, not the most famous, Sapiens, but the second one that has all the big questions. I would say anybody working with design and ethics or who's interested in humanity's evolution in a positive way should read those questions and try and answer them in their own work because it's so powerful. So communication is a game changer. Well, I would have to agree. I think Rebekah as well, Anton. One thing about the collective narratives is that one of the ways of looking at this is, of course, the public narrative. So discourse in social media, politics, and so on. But it's easy to just look at that and point our fingers and go, that's just not me, that's the others, and the world is like it is, and I have nothing I can do about it. But if we look closer to ourselves in the mirror and now look at just, what an individual person can do, then one of the things that we're doing, all of us all the time, is we're having conversations. So what I wanted to sort of narrow down the conversation a little bit towards is if we now think of an individual rather than the mass, so you and I talking with Anton and somebody else in the street, how do we shift the narrative without having to then go and get a producer to create a new documentary? Because that's a big thing. That's a mundo level. That's mash. But from an individual perspective, and one of the obvious ways of doing that is obviously asking questions, asking the right question instead of giving always answers and opinions, but starting to formulate powerful questions that are deeper and better than the next, so like competing for the best questions.
And I think you find that, like when you're listening to yourself
Mhm.
and all your wonderful answers and giving your opinions, they tend to be they seem to be dead ends, actually. I mean, that's when kind of, I guess, the thought processes and creativity kind of, stop and wither. I mean, so actually questions are the key, I would
Mm.
say. Mm.
One of the things we could do here is to think like, if you had three questions to ask somebody, and let's imagine that we're not going into small talk. So you're in a conversation in Slush, okay, and that's actually going to happen probably in the next few weeks if we go there. But let's imagine a big event like Slush, where lots of startup founders, key influencers, media people, investors, they're all there talking about the future and mostly about the money that they're putting in a new innovation. But they're also people interested in talking about the bigger picture. What would be three questions or one or two even questions that we could ask people to help trigger a new narrative rather than always, refer to a tool, a documentary, or a person, but like that we would actually have the conversations. And this is a creative challenge for you and I. And maybe Anton, you'll have some contributions as well. So
Maybe
what
you
kind
will.
of questions?
I rely on Anton, actually.
So
Questions are
let's get
hard,
what we
but
can what we
I
need.
have one.
Go on.
Okay, and this is actually related to, well, also around the same time, I kind of like got fascinated in the internet as graveyard. And particularly, I started thinking of David Bowie. Have you actually followed his latest work? I mean, well, he doesn't do too much these days. But just before he was going, and during his journey, to the other side, I mean, there was this big kind of like recording and creative process around his, his dying
Mm.
stages. And I would like to ask them ask anyone, how do they imagine their soul to live within the space of the internet?
Mm. So in a way, the question, and by the way, let's make an extra criteria to make this more
Mm-hmm.
creative. The more we put creative constraints, you know the drill. You've been in
Yep.
hackathons, the better creativity. So let's narrow
Mm-hmm.
this down to only green questions. So by green,
Okay.
I'm talking about the periodic table, sort of empathic, open questions that are not piping it with a direction inbuilt in it or leading to
Mm-hmm.
action, that are just open explorative questions: how, what, why, when, with an open direction. So this one, how would you? I'm writing this down. How would you imagine your soul
Mm-hmm.
in the metaverse or in the future internet?
Well, yeah, but actually, that's when I would say, if we're going back to nature, even, how would you imagine your soul in space?
And I'll build on that idea, since the rules of brainstorm I haven't clarified, but you know them off by heart. Go for
Mm-hmm.
quantity, don't judge. Go for like creative builds, and go yes and instead of yes but. So in that context, I'm going to build on top of that and say,
Okay.
how would you imagine the planet if the planet was still here in 2,000 years? How
Mm-hmm.
would you imagine your life being different in 2,000 years? Because what it does is that it builds in already the idea that it's going to be in 2,000 years still okay. And we could even add in that question, like, if the planet was absolutely thriving with humanity, how would you be living? So to force it
Mm-hmm.
into the non-dystopian, oh, it's going to be everything, difficult. But
Mm-hmm.
so 2,000 years in the future, that's another build. What else could we ask? Anton, Greenland sharks live for more than 500 years.
Nice.
They were a baby when Shakespeare was alive. What would you do if you lived 500 years? Yeah, more tangible than 2,000. Thank you, Anton. If
Very
you were
nice.
a Greenland shark, what would you? That's a good one for Slush,
Mhm.
to get conversations in Slush
Oh,
to go
yeah.
beyond the
That'll blow people's
usual.
minds.
You know, another approach would be,
Mhm.
okay, in terms of science and technology. I mean, you've been in so many different directions with that, but
Mhm.
what are the big fears? One of them you mentioned is bots taking over.
Mhm.
But then we are often talking about how bots or technology or AI could really, really help speed up the
Mhm.
positive change of cleaning things up.
Yeah.
So So maybe that could be another angle, is like inquiring about, in a conversation, what positive examples have you got about ...
Yeah, that's good. That's good. But yeah, I like Anton's comment as well. Humans have no ability for long-term thinking. I think that's why I'm stuck so much.
Well, let's go back to the present. Let's go present, future. So like
Mhm,
next week in Slush,
mhm.
because I'm going to go probably and do this. I'm going to go. I like being
Gosh,
a
yeah.
little bit rebellious and go out and ask the difficult questions. That's why we call the green
Mhm.
elephant. So
Yep.
the elephant in the room is often not talked about. People are just talking about the surface. So an elephant
Mhm.
in the room is that everything seems to be negative. So one way of putting the positive, saying, what positive examples do you have that inspire you? Um, that inspire you to hope, because of
Mm.
course humans are quite easily pessimistic. We're hardwired for that. You probably have data to show that we have a negative bias towards problems, pains, and fear, because our
Mm.
attention, or is that a fallacy, a myth?
Well, it's partly a little bit. I mean, of course, when we're making our, when we're making our quick decisions, for instance, when we're operating through our primal, cognitive affective system,
Mm.
then of course, when we're sensing immediate threat and danger, then, like we tend to kind of click in without thinking. Of course, we see
That, yeah.
bear or a lion, and then we go chung. But at the
Mm.
same time, of course, like, well, we go on roller coasters, we want to watch horror movies, like we want to, tap into, our deepest fears, and we get pleasure
Mm.
out of that. So emotions are very complex from that perspective. And
Mm.
actually, I mean, more and more we have been actually discussing the fact that you can't easily measure someone's emotional experience through, were you happy? Did this make you happy?
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
and in fact, even though you're saying that, I see a lot of HR managers doing exactly that in companies. They're just
Oh.
measuring, do you like, not like, what I like to use as a filter for
Mm.
this is, particularly when talking about emotions, is the drama triangle, Cartman's victim,
Mhm.
savior, aggressor, which you know off by heart. That in that triangle, when I start measuring, for example, people's attitude to a conflict, which is a big thing, um, everybody places the people in the room, when you analyze what they're thinking, with different roles on that triangle, and they think it's reality, it's objective, but it's
Mhm.
not. So they're all projections. So maybe one direction here for us to think about is, how do you cut through that subjectivity, and go right to the core of basic human mechanisms? Because if we
Mm.
are hardwired as a machine as being slightly negative and biased, how do we bypass that in a conversational setting?
Yeah, I mean, it seems with training,
Mm.
with practice, absolutely. And of course, it's, a mindset thing, which again, like is very much based on, well, training also, I guess, like your environments. Um, a lot of different factors, but I mean, again, if we like are prone to think negative, I mean, and of course you notice in your life there's some people that are more positive than others, and
Mhm.
and even when we're looking towards children, there are some happier children than other children. So of course, negative emotions are our warning system. you know they're there
They're
to
there for a
protect
reason.
us.
It's there to protect us, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. But then at the same time, there's an interaction between our lower order thinking and, of course, emotions, and our higher order as well. And
Mm.
some people are more in tune with these higher orders, and are able to see things or reframe things in a different way from earlier on.
So that brings us to metacognitive and metacognition and metacognitive communication. So, in a way, when you have the ability, I mean, that's one of the things that makes us different to animals, other
Mhm.
animals on the planet, is that we're more metacognitive. We can look at ourselves from a distance.
Absolutely, definitely, this is one of the traits of human beings.
So the meaning we give to thing is more easy for us to shift than an animal that would, or a plant that would, if they're sentient enough to
Mhm.
give a meaning, would probably be having less creative choice about the meaning they give to it.
Absolutely, definitely.
So here comes another question. What
Mhm.
meaning do you give the current ecological crisis?
Ah,
Go,
well,
go,
what I give
I,
is, of course, that it's a sign that we're doing the wrong things.
hmm. And that
Yeah, when we
question,
put our values
what
in the right places. Yeah.
what about in terms of, by the way, welcome Michelle in the chat. He was posting, how well would my soul communicate and help another with trees, plants, animals, etc. So,
Mm.
like, looking at what's interesting with ecology is that the whole value exchange system is way more complex than money for time, like we do with
Mm-hmm.
humans. There's all those different levels of value exchanges chemically are happening in nature, which in human interactions, when you're looking at technology,
Mm-hmm.
you're noticing how poor sometimes the sensorial interactions are when you reduce it to an internet connection. But
Yeah.
in the future, that's going to expand. So
Mm.
um, when that whole level of interaction becomes not just physiologically around senses, but it becomes
Mm.
chemical or
Mm.
unconscious and neuro,
Mm-hmm.
there's going to be an unknown future with that. What's your most exciting positive example of sustainable technology? Anything. Like,
Oh,
inspire me, basically, because I need inspiration. I'm looking at a lot of things. And same thing to Anton. What's your
yeah.
most inspiring example of sustainability? Because you talk about it a lot, you have examples, but what's one?
Yeah,
Oh,
I'd
and
love to
Anton,
see Anton's.
Anton is
The
Anton's
natural
on
thing.
fire. He has another question which I'm going to write down.
Yeah,
Name the most famous optimists on the
on the
planet. It's
planet.
not
We've got
easy.
to Google that. I
But
mean,
I think that's a question for Slush.
yeah, in terms of the most inspiring things, I'd say edible ice cream containers. I mean, well, hey, ice
Oh,
cream cones, edible um, hamburger boxes. When they started trying to experiment with that in the 1980s, I think, like edible things.
yeah, edible. Yeah, that's a really good point because ultimately we have a huge
Yeah,
amount of mouths to feed.
yeah.
So make that's a really interesting example. Anything that is made that can be recycled through eating is a complete
Mm,
shift in, yeah.
yeah.
Okay, so that's another question I'm going to write down is what examples of edible.
Oh gosh, no, I think that it's challenging enough to actually make them think like, I mean, what is the most inspiring
Oh,
sustainable?
Anton's just done another one. Let me
Oh yeah,
see.
France
France today
banned
banned all national flights that are under 2 hours and subsidized national train services. Amazing.
that is
Thank
cool.
you, Anton. Yeah. So there are examples out there. And in terms of technology, when you're looking at VME's work,
Hmm.
what are the kind of things that you're getting excited about in there?
Well, we're getting excited on harnessing people's experiences, people of cognitive sensory diversity, finding out ways to engage people as drivers of our technological future through eyes that, many of the mainstream or traditionally, through eyes that and ears that have traditionally. What is one? Oh, hang on a second. Oh, he wants the crocodile. Hang on a second. Sorry. So basically, through eyes and ears that we haven't had access to understand, like, I mean, and to not just understand, but to get people in there and get people driving the future. Like through sensory experience and sensibility that has often been ignored in the past. So we're kind of like, I guess, relegated to the people being designed for rather than being the designers. I mean, we talk about co-creation and co-design, and that's wonderful, and that's definitely a positive step. But what would things be like if we do get people of cognitive sensory diversity actually taking charge within that?
So
So this is something we're working on.
yeah, because the co-creation is fashionable because the
Mm,
process of co-creating together is
absolutely.
interesting, but being just literally more inclusive of neurodiversity, people on the spectrum who have autism,
Absolutely.
people who have impaired vision, who are more senior and who don't have the tech abilities to understand what's really going on with their interface, the black box, as you said earlier.
Yeah, and what would the world be like if they come in and then they start designing the future? Like, I mean, and
Mm.
of course that's always been the big kind of problem with, for instance, designing for the elderly. Like, we make it big grey, ugly, but it's usable. But they don't necessarily want to use it, firstly, because of the technology, and second, because it doesn't tap into their lived experience and expression of identity, who they want to be seen as. Do they want to be seen as big, grey, easy to use?
Yeah, exactly. So there's an untapped potential there as well around
Absolutely.
designing more inclusively, which obviously is not mainstream because people look at the so-called average. I just remember from university, my first week, we had a lecturer who came in with a book called Anthropometrics, which is like measuring humans. And he said to us, okay, you're going to design us a perfect chair. And he gave us all the charts for the human measurements. And then he let us loose on designing the so-called perfect chair with all the metrics. And then after a couple of days, we came back and the big conclusion was that if you try and design everything as an average, it becomes unusable.
Yes.
And so in the end, what we had was an unusable chair that was designed for an average of all parts of the body. And literally it was an unusable chair. So kind of the idea of average and doing so-called normal people is very counterproductive in design. We know that's why we go and talk to real people.
Exactly.
What would be now? Let's now play a game. Imagine that you were in Slush. You probably, like me, will be a little bit challenged to get there. But let's imagine that we go to Slush or an event like that. And we go in there and everybody's having their fancy conversations about their startups getting money. And that we want to sort of shake them up a little bit, asking them, so far as questions we have, what would you imagine your soul to be in space? That would get some of them going. How would it be, like Anton's question about Greenland sharks? Like if you were a Greenland shark, what would you imagine a beautiful, positive example of the future of some kind or something around? What meaning do you give the current ecological crisis? Because as we know, meaning is personal, arbitrary, and very creative exercise. If you look at Viktor Frankl's work, it's all about like, I heal by the meaning. So the meaning is a third one that we have. And then one of the most famous optimists that also Anton was adding. I'm inviting now everybody in the chat, you as well, Rebekah, to get creative about not so much answering questions, but now thinking of what kind of questions could we ask to change the collective narrative about technology, humans, and the planet. Very, very small sandbox. Any other open questions? I got Anton putting...
Also, Michelle, how to encourage everybody to put positive thinking into practice.
Which is also like, I don't know if you heard this earlier, Michelle, but we were talking about how to get people talking, particularly if they're more senior and that they don't have as much interest in connecting with each other. One of the things that came out is food. So maybe a question, maybe we could actually take, instead of asking a question, maybe we bring a question only in a context of food. So maybe the question is asked with food as an offering.
Absolutely. Then you'd be very memorable as well.
So what kind of food should we bring? Because if I go to Slush, I'm going to have a real challenge bringing food to everybody. What kind of food would you give?
Branding. Sorry.
Yes, it has to be smelly, so it brings more sensorial.
And it has to taste good. Yeah.
It has to taste good. And it has to be portable and small, so that limits things quite a lot.
Chocolate. Many fashion companies or designer labels have actually attached their labels. I've forgotten who they are. Obviously, I didn't eat the chocolate, but they attached their brand to chocolate.
That's an interesting way. So just basically we brand some chocolates around sustainability and cognitive science.
Yes, and give them some dopamine. It is dopamine that comes from chocolate.
So and just as the dopamine hits their brain, then we ask the next question, the creative question.
Yes, exactly.
So any other questions that we could come up with? Because ultimately, if you are looking at a collective narrative that is built of lots of individual meanings and that everybody has a choice of meaning and that we don't have to give it the worst possible meaning at all costs, then the question obviously is why, what would make a person actually give themselves permission to do that? Because I've noticed people don't really want to answer things positively. They'd rather go into the cynical It's all that kind of thing. So maybe how do we find some question or something that would unlock that cynicism?
But I kind of wonder the mindset of people at Slush anyway. I think that, they could be, caught up in the hype and excitement of being there. I mean, there, and particularly also at the Nordic Business Forum. I mean, two big events, very different cultures, but then at the same time, you've got lots of excited people with, kind of their own versions of hope. So,
Which
I don't
actually,
know.
the question Anton just posed, as is a good one to sidestep that, is aside from money, what is your next most important metric of success?
Yeah.
What's the KPIs? Anton, do you have any good examples of KPIs for sustainability that everybody can easily understand and look into and start measuring, other than the usual metrics that people are using? Do you have any interesting new ones to share that could be like metrics of success in terms of sustainability? And and Anu is bowing to that question. Anu has this story about powerful questions being so much more interesting than the answers themselves, because you can ask a question that leads to another question, and then that depths of thinking open up from that. What question should I have asked you, Rebekah, that I didn't ask you? You know yourself. I don't know you as well as you know you. So what question should I have asked you?
That's a good question. How are you today?
Back to the fundamentals.
Yeah,
no,
exactly. Yeah, no. I don't know.
One thing is playfulness and humor is something that's very seldom associated with environmentalism. I notice a lot of people taking it very seriously, as in a way it should, because it's a serious topic. But humor is not just a form of distance and creating like that sort of, I'm laughing at everything. Humor, I've noticed in terms of interpersonal growth, one of the major ways that people can get through difficult conflicts is to be able to laugh at themselves. Yeah. So I was just wondering about humor and the topic of sustainability.
Yep.
Anton said it's hard apart from the compliance stuff. No real metrics are set for beyond compliance. Yeah. So really the legal compliance, as far as we move with legal, is as far as companies are going to measure.
Yeah. Yep. Yes.
Okay. So here's another question. I actually tested this with Vila's students yesterday. If you were to take the SDGs, the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals, which are usually associated with corporate governance and large institutions, but if a person were to actually ask that, what SDG do you personally care most about? Like, it's a reflection of a personal value.
Yeah, that's a very interesting thing. I mean, well, naturally, I guess I go into, the reduction of poverty. That's something that I see that is connected to many different other sustainable development goals. Of course, the economic ones, educational, also environmental. Because when people aren't living in states of panic, they are more likely to be reflective, to stop and think about what they're doing. They're not thinking about, immediate survival. They're also thinking, well, actually, if I do this, then I will be helping that. But if they're constantly in this state of panic, then, well, and they're just kind of getting by day, then that's certainly not something that people are getting invested in. I think I'm going to have to take my little guy to bed in a second.
Yeah. Let's start wrapping up this and do a checkout, because otherwise you're going to be too far away from it. So I just had the SDGs up behind here, but I'm going to now close this and go back to where we were. So we've been through, I've taken some notes on the process. So, and we're also going to do a transcript of this just for fun and just to see what we had. But we opened up lots of questions: solitude versus loneliness, meaningful communication, multisensorial internet, naturally human-centered, ecola ethics. I'd be very curious to see more about those kind of checklists. Collective amnesia that humans have about about things. And then we started opening up that documentary from 2017 about a different narrative. And then the importance of shifting the narrative around sustainability and Anton's contributions around Greenland sharks. And you were talking about cognitive diversity, internet graveyards. And eventually we landed back onto converging to a couple of questions that were things that we could potentially play with and ask people to have a different level of conversation than just the usual business small talk. So my question to you, Rebekah, is what has shifted, or what takeaway are you taking away from today's conversation?
Oh, definitely about the whales. I didn't know that they could live 500 years. I think, I don't know. I think that this was a very inspiring conversation. It's nice to actually think of the importance of questions in terms of course, creating change. I mean, questions are very, very good. We actually should be questioning what we're doing more often. And also we should be questioning, for instance, if we're going to get into the ethics and social ethics, just because we can do something, should we be doing something? Why do we always need to go with, what we can just do, what the technology allows us to do? We can jump in a car and burn rubber and burn lots of petrol. We can jump on an aeroplane whenever we want, but should we be doing that? So I think that, these questions are very interesting. Absolutely. And I really look forward to hearing about your adventures at Slash.
If I get in, and I might not, I might have to go to another event or crash a side event.
I
But that's
feel
okay.
so bad about that because, usually there's some kind of Slush ticket hanging around somewhere.
Oh, just for those who didn't know, Rebekah was trying to get me a ticket. So that's why. But no, last things. So thank you, Rebekah. I'll be doing a transcript of this, and there'll be a replay in YouTube. But I'll send you a transcript because some of the things that came out might be just interesting to reread. But in terms of the key takeaway for me is, a couple of really powerful questions have come out of this. Some new thinking areas like the black box of ethics, and I'm really going to look into Ecola ethics that you worked on with Villa. But the other takeaway I had is the importance of narrative. I think that's like key, big takeaway for today, narrative.
Definitely.
Thank you. I'm going to let you get off and do the other present-oriented duties. Thank you very much, Rebekah.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone, Michelle and Anton especially, there in the chat. Thank you and see you later. Bye. And thank you very much, Estève. This was great.
Good night. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye. Okay.